Okay, let's go ahead and get started, shall we? Okay, so welcome, good evening. It is time for another chapter out of the Hiram Key, and because these chapters are so long, I'm only going to do one tonight. Some of these are ridiculously long. So, we're on chapter 8, I believe. Yeah, chapter 8. So, I missed my reading on Friday, and then again on Monday, my Star Wars reading on Monday. Things not just not working out. Okay, so anyway, chapter 8, the first Freemason. Much of our energies have been devoted to unraveling the mysteries of Egypt, but while we were starting to focus on particular characters and events which had meaning for us as Freemasons, we were always looking for patterns in history. Sometimes the conventional interpretation of historical events is jarred by facts that don't fit into the accepted pattern. When these historical glitches occur, it is sometimes possible to glimpse a new truth behind the accepted face of history. It was just such a glitch which first directed our attention to the Hyksos period of Egyptian history. Today, Egyptologists label this era as the Second Intermediate Period, 1782 to 1570 BC, falling between the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom. Here was a major perturbation in the smooth flow of Egyptian history. It was the sort of catastrophe from which few civilizations ever recover, yet we knew that Egypt had not only recovered, but had gone on to reach new heights of achievement. Despite the total decline of its traditional monarchy and the domination of the native population for 6 generations by a group of foreign invaders whom we had first come across by the romantic name of the Shepherd Kings. Why this had happened was a major mystery. We felt it highly likely that the era of change from the Egyptian kings to the Hyksos rulers, then back again to the Theban monarchy, would provide further clues, so we concentrated on this period using all possible sources of information, including the Old Testament. Hiram Abif discovered. If there was a connection from ancient Egypt to the Jews of the 1st century AD, it almost certainly would be through Moses, the founder of the Jewish nation, who had been an adopted member of the Egyptian royal family. The possibility of finding such a link seemed remote, but we kept searching as we reviewed the facts known to us. Having undergone the 3rd degree of Freemasonry, the one that conferred the status of Master Mason on us, we have to say that the references to Hiram Abif and the Old Testament baffled us both. The following words are spoken by the worshipful master when first introducing the ancient character to the candidate. Quote, "Death has no terror equal to that of the stain of falsehood and dishonor. Of this grand truth the annals of Freemasonry afford a glorious example in the unshaken fidelity and ultimately untimely death of our Grand Master Hiram Abif, who lost his life just before the completion of King Solomon's temple, at the construction of which, as you are doubtless aware, he was the principal architect." End quote. There's a very clear assumption that the educated candidate should be aware of this character from his existing knowledge, presumably from the Bible. Neither of us had ever heard of such a person, and no version of the Bible that we have come across makes any mention of an architect for Solomon's temple. Because Hiram, king of Tyre, or Tyre, I've heard it pronounced Tyre, provided the labor and the cedar, some have connected the two, but there is no possible link apart from the fact that they share a name. We, like all Freemasons of our acquaintance, accept the Masonic hero despite knowing that he was not recorded as being involved in the creation of Solomon's temple. If the name of the master builder had been known to the authors of the Book of Kings, especially in the light of his murder, it seems almost impossible that they would ignore such a key person when telling this story. At first, this suggested to us that he must be a much later invention, possibly representing another important character whose role had been played down in history for the sake of a single strand drama. The only reasonable explanation that we had come across regarding the actual name of the Masonic hero was that Hiram meant noble or kingly in Hebrew, while Abif has been identified as Old French for lost one, giving a literal description of the king that was lost. By the time we had come to studying ancient Egypt, we had stopped trying to find Hiram Abif because we had no leads at all and thought it was an impossible task. Yet strangely, it was Hiram Abif who emerged from the distant past to find us. Once we had researched in a far wider manner than we ever set out to, thereby becoming familiar with many details from ancient Egypt, a potential solution to the greatest of all Masonic mysteries slowly unveiled itself. Convinced that there was a secret ceremony central to the king-making of ancient Egypt based on a temporary death and resurrection, we set ourselves the task of trying to understand how the Israelites could have come into possession of these very special mysteries. Our starting point in connecting the two was easy. The Bible spells out the importance of Egypt in the history of the Jewish people, with such major characters as Abraham, Jacob, Isaac, Joseph, and Moses, all heavily involved in Egyptian events. The last two of these are presented as very senior members of the royal court, albeit at different times. The later chapters of the book of Genesis paint a picture of tolerance and cooperation between the Egyptians and the proto-Israelites, yet Exodus depicts a situation of great bitterness between the two peoples. The reasons for this rapid change in relationship became much clearer once we came to understand the period of the so-called Hyksos kings, and the person who was Hiram Abif turned out to be the central figure to the whole story. The collapse of the Egyptian state. Working through the development of Egypt, we arrived at the low point of the nation's history, late in the Middle Bronze Age, around the end of the 3rd millennium BC. Egypt entered a period of continual decline with weak government and social breakdown. Foreigners from the desert spread across the land, robbery became commonplace, and the open, relaxed lifestyle of the people gave way to mistrust and a tendency to rely on themselves for security rather than trust the state. Slowly the spirit and vigor that had made Egypt great sapped away, leaving the country exposed to the wanton gaze of outsiders. Inevitably, invasion followed, and the Egyptians became dominated by a people known as the Hyksos. The Hyksos did not suddenly sail up the Nile and demand surrender. The process was far more subtle than that. They infiltrated Egyptian society smoothly and over a great period of time, until they were in a strong enough position to force their control on the two lands. History provides us for some very specific dates for this loss of national vigor, called today the Second Intermediate Period, putting it between the years 1780 and 1560 BC, at the end of a much longer section of Egyptian history now called the Middle Kingdom. And I think we're about ready to go into an ad, so I'm going to keep an eye out here. We found that Hyksos did not mean shepherd kings. It actually came from the Egyptian term Hikahoswet, meaning simply desert princes. They were believed to have been a mixed group of Asiatic people, mainly Semites, who appeared out of Syria and Palestine. Their final seizure of power inevitably met with resistance, which resulted in the burning of some uncooperative towns and the destruction of temples, culminating in the complete sacking of the Egyptian capital Memphis in about 1720 BC. The Hyksos were no believers in Ma'at, and in their search for power they initially dealt cruelly with anyone they felt. Oh, we're in an ad. It's not showing up everywhere. It's only showing up on one spot. Oh, no. That's why I keep my phone open, so I can see when the ads actually start. Okay, so I will back up. I don't know how far we were into it when I finally noticed. I'll just go back to the beginning of that paragraph um, now that we're back from the ad. We found that Hyksos did not mean shepherd kings. It actually came from the Egyptian term Hikau Koswet, meaning simply desert princes. They are believed to have been a mixed group of Asiatic people, mainly Semites, who appeared out of Syria and Palestine. Their final seizure of power inevitably met with resistance, which resulted in the burning of some uncooperative towns and a destruction of temples, culminating in the complete sacking of the Egyptian capital, Memphis, in about 720 BC. The Hyksos were no believers in Ma'at, and in their search for power they initially dealt cruelly with anyone they felt was an obstacle to their cause, but once established they were not difficult oppressors, and the Egyptian authorities appear to have largely collaborated with them. By the 18th century BC they had extended their rule right into Upper Egypt. Coming largely from the countries we would now call Israel and Syria, the Hyksos all spoke the same Western Semitic language as the people who would later become known as Israelites. The question that immediately came into our mind was, were the Hyksos in fact Jews? The answer had to be no, not in the full sense of the word, because the concept of Judaism did not exist at that time. The scattered nomadic tribes, which the Egyptians called the Habiru, Hebrew, were a range of Semitic Asiatics who spoke the same language but were in no way an identifiable race. It is, however, extremely likely that the Hyksos/Habiru peoples did, at a later date, form a substantial part of the tribal cooperative that became the tribes of Israel and eventually the Jewish people. There are several reasons why we believe that there is a direct connection between the Hyksos and the Jews, not least the fact that the first mention in the Bible of the Jewish people coincides precisely with the time when the Egyptians chased the Hyksos out of their land, to Jerusalem. Recent geological evidence is beginning to show that the desert state of much of the Middle East is a relatively recent occurrence, and that as recently as 5 or 6,000 years ago, the terrain around Egypt was a much greener and more fertile area. Records show that there were sudden and dramatic periods of climatic change during the second millennium BC, bringing drought as a seasonal problem across the entire Near East. As believers in the principle of Ma'at, the Egyptians were a generous people and provided the wandering Habiru with water and land on which to graze their sheep when conditions outside the Nile Delta became unbearable. A clear example of this is given in Genesis 12:10. Quote, "And there came a famine in the country, and Abram went down into Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was very grievous in the land." Sorry, I don't know. End quote. I lost it there for a second. I don't know what's. Okay. During the period of decline in Egyptian society, control of these water hungry Asiatics was poor, and they were allowed to stream in in huge numbers and were not required to leave when their needs had been met. Without an immigration policy, the country became overrun by these nomadic people. Furthermore, they were followed by far more sophisticated people, ones who saw an opportunity for gain in the general confusion. These Semitic city dwellers, the Hyksos, were much more warlike than the overconfident Egyptians and possessed highly advanced weapons, including horse-drawn chariots, which allowed them to take what they wanted without significant resistance from the peace-loving indigenous population. The Hyksos kings. It is probable that during the Hyksos period the Habiru tribesmen enjoyed a higher social status and became more assimilated into city life. Prior to this, the only way for one of these desert herdsmen to improve his lot and enjoy the benefits of city life had been to offer himself as a slave to an Egyptian family. This arrangement was not slavery in the sense that most people today might imagine it. It was more like being a servant with a lifetime contract. Wages may not have been good, but the quality of life would have been far higher than the vast majority of people could ever aspire to. Once the Hyksos kings became settled, they started to sponsor the building of temples as well as the production of statues, reliefs, scarabs, general works of art, and some of the finest literary and technical works of the time. They appear to have had little cultural heritage of their own and quickly adopted Egyptian ways and attitudes. These new rulers started to write their names in Egyptian hieroglyphics, took the traditional titles of the Egyptian kings, and even gave themselves Egyptian personal names. The Hyksos kings at first spread their influence to, to rule Lower Egypt, the larger and lusher of the two lands. From their newly created city of Avaris, where they adopted as their state god a deity which had been especially revered in the area where they had first settled. This god was Set or Seth, who had similarities to their previous Canaanite god Baal. They centered their theology on Set, but they also accepted Re, or Ra, as a major god, and they honored him in the throne names that they gave themselves. Later, they controlled both the two lands from the old capital of Memphis. It is fair to say that there was something of a symbiotic relationship by which the invaders gained culture and theological refinement, and the Egyptians new technology such as chariots and other weaponry, including composite bows and bronze swords to replace their simple and ancient designs. They also gained a further important thing from the Hyksos: cynicism. They had been far too open and easy going for their own good in the past, with little regard for the proactive defense of their country. The experience of the Hyksos period provided a powerful lesson, and a new positive outlook emerged that laid the foundation for the resurgence of the Egyptian spirit in what we call the New Kingdom. Although they had lost control of the old capital, Memphis, elements of the true Egyptian monarchy continued to exist in the upper Egyptian city of Thebes. From records, it is clear that the Thebans acknowledged the sovereignty of their Asiatic overlords, with whom they seem to have been on good terms, as in time the Hyksos kings became absorbed into much of Egyptian culture and religious practices. Inevitably, a politico-theological problem emerged. The invaders started to want spiritual power as well as physical power. For instance, the Hyksos ruler King Kian, or Kiana, assumed the Egyptian throne name of Seuserenre, as well as the titles the Good God and the Son of Re, and in addition created for himself the Horus name, Embracer of Regions, a title that suggested worldwide domination. This claim by the Hyksos to be the Son of God must have outraged the Egyptian people at every level. Here, we believe, is a major issue which has not yet been sufficiently examined by modern Egyptologists. We now know that there was a very special point during the king-making process that made the new Horus unchallengeable, but the would-be Hyksos kings, for all their stately power and their emulation of Egyptian religion, were excluded from this, the ultimate accolade. How could a foreigner simply change his name from Kian to Seuserenre, yeah, okay, and style himself Horus without undergoing the highly secret initiation process known only to the real kings of Egypt and their inner sanctum? The simple answer is that he couldn't. It is completely beyond the bounds of reason to think that the Egyptians would have shared their great secrets with their brutish foreigners. But because Kian desperately wanted this powerful title and had no access to it legitimately, he had little option but to assume the empty title. Superficially, relationships between the Egyptians and their new masters were good, but resentment must have been high. Furthermore, despite aping Egyptian styles, that maybe there's a typo there. Furthermore, despite aping, A-P-I-N-G, Egyptian styles and customs, the Hyksos remained essentially different. Well, maybe that isn't a typo. Anyway, the grafting of the Hyksos onto Egypt was at best superficial. They spoke Egyptian with an amusing accent, wore beards, Egyptians shaved daily unless in mourning. They had a strange dress sense, and they transported themselves in wheeled machines they called chariots, which were pulled by horses instead of donkeys. The loss of the original secrets. We, we continued our research into the late Middle Kingdom and felt sure that the tensions between the new Hyksos kings and the true royal line must have reached a peak with these false claims to being the Horus. If we had been right about the secret resurrection ceremony of the legitimate kings, there had to be trouble brewing with these presumptuous interlopers. These presumptuous interlopers pressing to obtain the royal secrets once they had taken everything else. Taking control of daily life was one thing, pushing into the realm of the gods, both heavenly and earthly, must have been intolerable. Once the Hyksos kings were of the third and fourth generation to be born in Egypt and had embraced Egyptian theology, it seems almost certain that they felt entitled to possess the secrets of the Horus, but they considered themselves to be the Horus. Perhaps more importantly, they wanted to become Osiris in death and be a star to shine forever and ever. Having become kings of Egypt, why should they die a Canaanite death, when to die as Horus would give them eternal life? This was a complex and fascinating epoch, and we studied and restudied the events and characters involved, something about the period in general, and about the attitude and actions of the true Egyptian king, Sequenenre Tao II, in particular, started to niggle at the back of Chris's mind. This king was restricted to the upper Egyptian city of Thebes towards the end of the Hyksos rule, and for a whole variety of small reasons, Chris had a feeling that the story of Hiram Abiff could have started with a power battle between Sequenenre Tao II and the important Hyksos king Apepi I, who took the Egyptian throne name Re, great and powerful like Re, and the title King of Upper and Lower Egypt, son of Re. Excuse me. For months, Chris mulled over the period, looking for more and more evidence that would dispel or confirm some substance to the niggle. Always that niggle, Niggle, don't freak out, solidified into a strong hunch. Chris tells how that came about. Quote, I knew that the Hyksos king Apepi was also known as Apophis. It was a highly significant piece of nomenclature that alerted me to his involvement in a spiritual battle that was nothing less than a rerun of the founding of the nation by Osiris, Isis, and the first Horus. I became convinced that Apophis was a man who deliberately set out to get the secrets of the true Egyptian kings for himself, come what may. The Hyksos people were warlike and self-centered. They adopted as their chief god Set, the murderer of his brother Osiris, the god who every Egyptian king expected to become. By identifying themselves with Set, the Hyksos demonstrated their disdain for the Egyptian people and their allegiance with the forces of evil. The concept of Ma'at must have seemed foolish to Apophis and symptomatic of the softness that had allowed his forebears to take the Egyptian country from them. The opposite of Ma'at was called Isfet, which stood for negative concepts such as selfishness, falsehood, and injustice, and according to Egyptian mythology, the leader of these embodiments of Ifset was an evil, dragon-like, monstrous serpent god called Apophis. I was amazed to find that this power of evil had the same name as the Hyksos king.
The epithets of this anti-monster included he of evil appearance and he of evil character, and for the Egyptians he was the very embodiment of primordial chaos. The serpent that the Hyksos king had named himself after was depicted as being deaf and blind to all things. It could only scream through the darkness and was chased away every day by the rising of the sun. It is little wonder that the greatest fear of every Egyptian was that the wicked serpent Apophis would one dark night win his battle with Re, and the next day would never come. To defend themselves from this ever-present threat, liturgies were recited daily in the temples of the sun god to give support to this continual battle between the forces of light and darkness. I discovered that a vast collection of liturgies had been found describing itself as the Book of Overthrowing Apophis. This was a secret book kept in the temple containing hundreds of magical words to ward off the evils of Apophis. Excuse me again. To ward off the evils of Apophis, and provided the novice reader with instructions on how to make wax figures of the serpent, which would be trodden into a shapeless mess, destroyed by fire, or dismembered with knives. The book required the student to carry out these acts every morning, noon, and night, and most especially at moments when the sun became obscured by clouds. 400 miles to the south of Avaris, the city of Thebes continued its line of Egyptian kings, although they bowed to the power of the Hyksos and paid to Apophis's tax collectors the dues demanded. Despite being isolated and impoverished, the Thebans struggled to maintain the customs of the Middle Kingdom period that they held dear. They were cut off by the Hyksos and their puppet rulers of Cush from the timbers of Syria, the limestone of Tura, the gold of Nubia, the ebony and ivory of the Sudan, and the quarries at modern Aswan and Wadi Hammamat, which forced them to improvise their building techniques. Given the severe limitations they faced, they managed to produce excellent buildings, albeit often in mud brick rather than stone. Nonetheless, the increasing hardships appear to have brought about a resurgence of the spirit and determination that had first made Egypt great, and whilst this quality of life continued to suffer, or while their quality of life continued to suffer, their learning and culture began to develop. The small city kingdom started to lift itself out of depression and disorder and to stand its ground against the Asiatics in Lower Egypt. My hunch was that around the 34th year of Apophis's rule, he instructed the king of Thebes to provide him with the secrets of becoming Osiris so that he could achieve the eternal life which was his due as rightful king of the two lands. The Theban king Sequenenre Tao II was a tough young man who considered himself to be the Horus and was not interested in parting with his birthright to anyone, let alone a bearded Asiatic named after the Serpent of Darkness. His instant rebuff must have quickly built up bad feelings between the two, and King Apophis started to use his power against Sequenenre in every way he could. A particularly significant example of this conflict was an order sent by Apophis over the 400 miles from Avaris to Thebes, complaining to Sequenenre about noise. Quote, "Have the hippopotamus pool, which is in the east of the city, done away with, for they do not let sleep come to me by day or by night." End quote. This message was no silly game to simply humiliate Sequenenre. It illustrates a very clear power struggle to establish nothing less than the divine right to rule. Apophis already had all the state power he could need, but what he did not have was the secret of resurrection and the blessings of the gods. His message was deeply political. The Thebans had revived the ritual harpooning of the hippopotami in their pool to the east of the city. It was an ancient holy rite intended to guarantee the safety of the Egyptian monarchy. This was clearly bound to irritate Apophis in itself, but it hurt even more because the hippopotamus was a form of the chief Hyksos god, Set, so a double insult was delivered to the Asiatic king. The hippopotamus ritual consisted of 5 scenes, which included a prologue, 3 acts, and an epilogue. The purpose of the play was to commemorate the victory of Horus over his enemies, his coronation as king of the 2 lands, and his ultimate triumph over those who opposed him. The king naturally played himself as Horus, and in Act 1 he casts 10 harpoons into a male hippopotamus alternately as Horus, Lord of Mesen, and Horus the Beditite, representing Lower and Upper Egypt. In Act 3, the victim is twice dismembered as a representation of Set. The power struggle may have continued for some time, but I believe that at some point Apophis decided to end the impudence of the Theban king and extract the secrets from Sequenenre once and for all. The outcome was to be the killing of Sequenenre, closely followed by the expulsion of the Hyksos and a return to the rule of the Egyptian kings. By now, Chris felt that his original niggle, which had turned into a hunch, was now shaping up into a respectable, if tenuous, hypothesis. He was ready to discuss it in detail with Robert, who quickly agreed that we just might have a candidate in Sequenenre for the origin of Hiram Abif. The biblical evidence. Our next step was to consider an additional important information source which could give us another perspective on the Apophis-Sequenenre struggle. Our insight into the events of the 16th century BC had been developed by a new merging of information drawn from written Egyptian history and Masonic ritual. Now, the book of Genesis could be added to the mix because, surprisingly, we found it to be rich in information about this period. The key figures who could potentially have any connection with Sequenenre and Apophis are Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and possibly Moses. Dating these characters has proved far more difficult for all experts than dating those of the later periods of Jewish history, from David and Solomon onwards, when there are much clearer landmarks in history to cross-refer to. The logical starting point in trying to identify where these famous 5 figures sit in the history was Joseph, the Asiatic or proto-Jew, who, the Bible tells us, came to occupy the highest office in Egypt, second only to the king himself. The story of Joseph, from his being sold into slavery by his brothers to his rise to power in Egypt and his famous coat of many colors derived from a later incorrect translation for a simple long-sleeved coat, is well known and is now generally accepted as being based on a real person. However, the legend was heavily embellished by those later scribes who first committed the oral tradition into a written form. References to camels as beasts of burden and the use of coins are both historically impossible, as neither existed until many hundreds of years after the latest possible dating of Joseph. According to the book of Genesis, Abraham first went down into Egypt when he was 75 and had his son Isaac when he was 100 years old, dying 75 years later. Isaac had 2 sons, Jacob and Esau, when he was 60 years of age, and Jacob had 12 sons, the second youngest of which was Joseph. It seems safe to assume some exaggeration here, particularly regarding Abraham's age. To work out more realistic time spans, we can start by assuming for a moment that Joseph was at the height of his powers in Egypt between the ages of 30 and 60. We can then work backwards to a probable time span between his high office and his great-grandfather Abraham's first arrival in Egypt. Jacob was apparently fond of fathering children by as many women as he could, including both his wives and their maidservants. Joseph was one of the youngest, and it is probable that his father was relatively old at the time of his birth, so let us assume that Jacob was 60. We can accept the biblical age of 60 for Isaac fathering Jacob, but will have to reduce Abraham's 100 years down to a more tenable 70 years. These ages follow the spirit of the information given in the Bible without accepting the obviously impossible extremes that have crept into the story. The book of Genesis tells us that Sarah, the wife of Abraham, was a very beautiful woman, and that Abraham feared that the Egyptians would kill him to steal her for themselves, so he passed her off as his sister. The logic is hard to follow, but as they are both later described as old and long past lovemaking when Isaac is eventually born, it does indicate that both of them were young people when they first went to Egypt. At the other end of our scale, we get one clue in the story of Joseph that helps us identify an historical date. That clue is a reference to the use of the horse-drawn chariot, which clearly places the event in the Hyksos period because these were vehicles of the Asiatic rulers, not the native kings. It is generally accepted that there were Semitic elements among the invaders, and so this would be a period during which Semitic immigrants would be favorably received. Many scholars have commented that the change in dynasty which followed the expulsion of the Hyksos might well correspond to the rise of, quote, a new king who did not know Joseph, end quote, Exodus 1:8, and that any foreigners left in Egypt would be liable to such treatment as is described in the early chapters of Exodus. There is little room for doubt that the migration of the Hebrews to Egypt during a drought in Canaan and the rise of the Hyksos rulers in Egypt parallels the political ascension of Joseph. The Pharaoh of Joseph's period welcomed the Hebrews to his kingdom because he was one of the Hyksos and a Semite like themselves. It has been suggested before now that when the Hyksos were overthrown, the new Egyptian monarch regarded the Hebrews as consorts of the Hyksos and therefore proceeded to enslave them. The experts seem to have been slow coming to the obvious conclusion of this evidence. Verses 8 and 9 in Exodus provide the clearest possible dating for Joseph and the unidentified Pharaoh. Quote, in the meantime there arose a new king over Egypt that knew not Joseph, and he said to his people, behold, the people of the children of Israel are numerous and stronger than we. End quote. We had now come to the firm conclusion that Joseph was contemporary with Apophis and therefore with Seqenenre Tau. We had to remind ourselves that we cannot take any of the words of the Old Testament to absolute evidence because of the gulf of time between the events and those who eventually recorded them. Remember the references to camels and coinage. They can be wrong in detail. Nonetheless, the broad shapes are probably a good indicator of what actually happened all that time ago. In simple terms, the Bible tells us that Joseph became the most important man in all Egypt, save for the Pharaoh himself. And therefore we concluded that Joseph was the vizier to the long-reigning Hyksos king Apophis, the opponent of Seqenenre Tau II. We worked the chronology backwards from the confrontation between Apophis and Seqenenre, dated by most scholars as circa 1570 BC, and for our own general purposes we assumed that the vizier Joseph was around 50 years old at the time. The following pattern then emerged. And there's a list here. I'll go ahead and show it to you, but then I am going to read it. There we go. Okay, so date BC and event. 1570, Joseph Vizier, possibly aged 50. 1620, Joseph born, his father Jacob known to be old, possibly aged about 60. 1680 BC, remember that's why the numbers are going up. Jacob born, his father Isaac known to be 60. 1740, Isaac born, his father Abraham said to be very old, say age 70. 1780 BC, Abraham enters Egypt for the first time, probably aged around 30. So, going in reverse order, because it's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, right? So, the ages we have given here are as true to the information available in the Bible as it is reasonably possible to be, and working backwards from the conflict between Apophis and Sequenenre, we came to place Abraham's entry into Egypt in the precise year that has been identified as the beginning of the Hyksos reign. The dramatic conclusion appears inescapable. Abraham was a Hyksos himself, perhaps even regarded as a prince. Remember, the Egyptian term Hyksos simply means desert princes, and all the evidence is that Abraham was a high-born man from Ur. We kept reminding ourselves that the authors of these stories had the distortion of almost 1,000 years to deal with, and that they, like every other superstitious people, would want to accommodate their prejudices and beliefs into the history that they interpreted and transcribed. The book of Genesis starts with extremely ancient accounts of man's origins, but quickly moves from distant legend to relatively recent history for the scribes. Nowhere do the authors openly mention the Asiatic conquest of the Egyptians that is known to have appeared in the period somewhere between Abraham and Moses. Were they ignorant of this period or perhaps ashamed? We cannot know, but the fact that it is apparently absent from their account of these very significant years in their history struck us as very odd. I just want to see how far we've got to go. Okay, apparently we're cutting in and out for some damn reason. Hopefully it doesn't keep that up. King Sequenenre was fighting a great mental battle with Apophis. The force of ancient darkness who had materialized as a Hyksos king in Lower Egypt, and he needed the full power of the sun god Amun-Re to give him strength to be victorious. Every day he left the royal palace of Malkata to visit the temple of Amun-Re at the hour of high noon, when the sun was at its meridian and a man cast almost no shadow, no stain of darkness across the ground. With the sun at its zenith, the power of Re was at its height, and that of the serpent of darkness, Apophis, was at its weakest. This statement, quote, whither our master Hiram had retired to pay his adoration to the Most High, as was his wonted custom, it being the hour of high 12, end quote, comes from the Masonic third degree ritual, which we explained in Chapter 1, where it is a previously explained comment. Now, in the context of Sequenenre, it made sense to us for the first time. This is our reconstruction of events. One day, unbeknown to Sequenenre, conspirators sent by Apophis had already tried to extract the secrets of Osiris from the two senior priests, and having failed to get the answers they needed, had killed them. They were terrified of what they now had to do, as they were lying in wait for the king himself, each placed at a different exit of the temple. As Sequenenre finished his prayers, he headed for the southern doorway, where he was met by the first of three men, who demanded to know the secrets of Osiris. He stood fast and refused each. The Masonic third-degree ceremony explains what happened that day over 3,500 years ago in the Temple of Thebes. For the sake of emphasizing the comparison, we have changed the names to the Egyptian ones. So then we have a long quote from the ritual. Quote, his devotions being ended, he prepared to retire by the south gate, where he was accosted by the first of these ruffians, who, for want of a better weapon, had armed himself with a plumb rule, and in a threatening manner demanded of our master Sequenenre the genuine secrets of Osiris, warning him that death would be the consequence of his refusal. But true to his obligation, he replied that those secrets were known to but 3 in the world, and that without the consent of the other 2, he neither could nor would divulge them. But as for himself, he would rather suffer death than betray the sacred trust reposed in him. This answer was not proving satisfactory. The ruffian aimed a violent blow at our master's forehead, but startled by the firmness of his demeanor, it only glanced down his right temple, yet with sufficient force to cause him to reel and sink to the ground on his left knee. Recovering himself from this situation, he rushed to the west gate, where he stood opposed by the second ruffian, to whom he replied as before, yet with undiminished firmness, when the ruffian, who was armed with a level, struck a violent blow on the left temple, which brought him to the ground on his right knee. Finding all chances of escape in both these quarters cut off, our master staggered, faint and bleeding, to the east gate, where the third ruffian was posted, and who, on receiving a similar reply to his insolent demand, for our master remained true to his obligation even in this most trying moment, struck him a violent blow full in the center of the forehead with a heavy stone maul, which laid him lifeless at his feet. End quote. The secrets of Egyptian king-making died with Sequenenre, the man we call Hiram Key, the king that was lost. We were feeling that we had by far the most probable candidate for our lost Masonic master, and we started to look more closely into what it is known about this man. We were utterly staggered when we first read the details of Sequenenre's mummy. The incredible facts of Sequenenre's injuries were described in detail. And we have another long quote here. Quote, when in July 1881 Emile Brugsch discovered the mummy of Pharaoh Ramses II, in the same cache was another royal corpse, some 300 years older than that of Ramses, and distinguished by its particularly putrid smell. According to the label, this was the body of Sequenenre Tao, one of the native Egyptian rulers forced to live far to the south in Thebes during the Hyksos period. And as was obvious even to the untutored eye, Sequenenre had met a violent end. The middle of his forehead had been smashed in, another blow had fractured his right eye socket, his right cheekbone, and his nose, a third had been delivered behind his left ear, shattering the mastoid bone and ending in the first vertebrae of the neck. Although in life he had clearly been a tall and handsome young man, with black curly hair, the set expression on Sequenenre's face showed that he had died in agony. After death he appears to have fared little better, as his body seems to have been left for some time, as his body seems to have been left for some while before mummification, hence the putrid smell and signs of early decomposition. Egyptian records are silent on how Sequenenre met his end, but almost certainly it was at the hands of the Hyksos/Canaanites. End quote. Whew. Okay. The impossible had just happened. We had identified Hiram Key, and what's more, his body still exists. The injuries fit perfectly. A vicious bone-crushing blow to the length of the right side of his face. he would certainly have reeled and dropped to his knee with such a vicious impact. Being young, tall, and powerfully built, he found his feet again in the way that strong men do in time of need, but he was met by another assailant who lashed at the left side of his head, again splintering bone. Massively weakened and close to collapse, he staggered on, but the last and lethal blow smashed squarely into his forehead, killing him instantly. Another description we found explains the wounds clearly. Quote, the terrible wounds on Sequenenre's skull were caused by at least 2 people attacking him with a dagger, an axe, a spear, and possibly a mace. End quote. Sit up again here. It took days for our excitement to settle down sufficiently to allow us to think about advancing our investigation. As the elation died down to simmering level, we took stock of what we had got. The instruments suggested as murder weapons recalled the symbolic Masonic legend in which Hiram was struck with a variety of temple building implements, including a heavy maul which would produce injuries similar to a mace. The previous description of the early decay of Sequenenre's body shows that the royal embalmers did not receive the body for quite some time after death, which brought to mind the circumstances described in the Masonic third degree concerning Hiram Abif's body, which went missing after the murder. Quote, his fears being naturally increased for the safety of his chief artist, he selected 15 trusty fellow crafts and ordered them to make diligent search for the person of our master, to ascertain if he were yet alive, or had suffered in the attempt to extort from him the secrets of his exalted degree. A stated day having been appointed for their return to Jerusalem, they formed themselves into 3 fellow craft lodges, and departed from the 3 entrances of the temple. Many days were spent in fruitless search. Indeed, one class returned without having made any discovery of importance. The second class were more fortunate, for on the evening of a certain day, after having suffered the greatest privations and personal fatigues, one of the brethren, who had rested himself in a reclining posture to assist his rising, caught hold of a shrub that grew near, which, to his surprise, came easily out of the ground. On a closer examination, he found that the earth had been recently disturbed. He therefore hailed his companions, and with their united endeavors reopened the grave, and there found the body of our master very indecently interred. They covered it again with all respect and reverence, and to distinguish the spot, stuck a sprig of acacia at the head of the grave, then hastened to Jerusalem to impart the afflicting intelligence to King Solomon. When the king's first emotions of his grief had subsided, he ordered them to return and raise our master to such a sepulchre as became his rank and exalted talents, at the same time informing them that by his untimely death the secrets of a master mason were lost. He therefore charged them to be particularly careful in observing whatever casual signs, tokens, or words might occur whilst paying this last sad tribute of respect to departed merit. End quote. Take out for a moment the placing of Hiram Abif in the name of King Solomon, and everything else fits. In the time of King Solomon. I don't know where I got name. We were also very interested to discover that King Sequenenre is the only known royal corpse from ancient Egypt to show signs of a violent death. So now we add the story of a man killed by 3 blows while protecting the secrets of the Egyptian kings from the Hyksos invaders. But what about a resurrection? Sequenenre had obviously not been resurrected, as his body is in the Cairo Museum. So our story was not yet complete. We therefore decided to re-examine our Masonic ritual. The Killers of Hiram Abif. In Masonic legend, the killers of Hiram Abif are named as Jubilo, Jubila, and Jubellum. together described as the Jews. Jewes. Juwes. The names themselves sound like symbolic invention. The only meaning we could deduce was that all three names contain Jubal, which is Arabic for mountain. This did not seem relevant in any way. It was the real assassins who interested us, not later symbolism. As we have already shown, the circumstances of Joseph described in the Bible indicates that he was a vizier to the Hyksos king Apophis, and so it is very likely that he would have been involved in the plot to extract the secrets from Sequenenre. The Bible also tells us that Joseph's father Jacob underwent a symbolic name change later in his life when he became Israel, and his 12 sons were identified as the tribes of Israel. This was, of course, the idea of the later authors of Jewish history who were seeking a clearly defined moment in time when their nation formally began. The sons of Jacob/Israel were given historical circumstances which seemed appropriate to the status of the tribes at the time when the writers of Genesis put ink to papyrus. The tribe of Reuben was seen to fall from grace, and the tribe of Judah was the new elite. Hence we call the descendants of the Israelites Jews, not Rubes. Searching for anything approaching a clue in these passages of the Bible, we came across a very odd verse in the King James Version of Genesis 49:6, which has no apparent meaning or reference to anything known. It appears at the point where Jacob is dying and reflecting on the actions of his sons, the new heads of the tribes of Israel. Quote, O my soul, come not thou into their secret unto their assembly. Mine honor, be not thou united, for in their anger they slew a man, and in their self will they digged down a wall. End quote. Here we had reference to a killing which must have been considered important enough to be included, yet not explained. What secret was sought? Who was slain? The Catholic Church describes this as a certain prophetic reference to the fact that the Jews killed their Christ, but we dismiss that interpretation. Our thesis suggests a more sensible possibility. The 4th to 9th words are unambiguous. Come not thou into their secret. In modern English, the import of this is, you failed to get their secret. The overall accusation amounts to, not only did you fail to get the secret, and to make things worse, you lost your temper and murdered him, undermining everything and bringing the whole world down on our heads. The two brothers and the future tribes of Israel who were held to account for this unknown murder are Simeon and Levi, the sons of Jacob/Israel by the blind woman Leah, whom he despised. Yet he had 2 kids by her. Okay. These tribes were clearly cursed for what they had done in slaying a man, but who was the unnamed victim? Although we thought it unlikely that the killers of Hiram Aviv were really called Simeon and Levi and were actually the brothers of Joseph, it did seem very possible that this strange verse contained the folk tradition of the killing of an unnamed man, which brought disgrace on 2 of the tribes of Israel. More to the point, why was the crime important enough to be included in the history of the Jews while the murdered individual goes unidentified? We were even more convinced that the answer might lie with Sequenenre Tau. The events leading to his murder, briefly outlined earlier, and its aftermath are so essential to our thesis that we think it important to go through them in greater detail here. Apophis was outraged. Who did this small-time king of Thebes think he was? Did he not realize that the world had changed forever and his empire was history, trampled beneath the Hyksos' heel? The king called in his vizier Joseph, who had ascended to his high rank through his ability to interpret Apophis's dreams, and told him that the time for friendly banter was over. The secrets must be extracted from Sequenenre without delay. The king was getting older, and he had every intention of having an Egyptian afterlife. Joseph was given responsibility for the project, and who better to send than two of his estranged brothers named Simeon and Levi? If they were found out and killed, it would not matter, as they deserved no better for selling Joseph into slavery all those years ago. If they succeeded, all well and good. Joseph would be a hero himself, and his brothers would have paid off an old debt. The brothers were fully briefed on what to do and the layout of the city. They may have shaved off their distinctive Hyksos beards before they entered Thebes, to avoid drawing too much attention to themselves. Once in the city, they made contact with a young royal priest of the temple of Amun-Re, who was known to be ambitious and easily influenced. The brothers explained that Apophis was tremendously powerful and had decided to destroy Thebes if he could not get the secret from Sequenenre. The young priest, we will call him Jubilo, was told that he alone could avert disaster for the entire population by helping them extract the secrets and making Apophis's attack unnecessary. And besides, they could ensure that he would be made high priest to Apophis once the secrets had been secured and the political struggle with Sequenenre was resolved. Jubilo was extremely frightened of these menacing Asiatics, but he knew what had happened at Memphis when the Hyksos were displeased. Maybe the only thing he could do was betray the trust put in him. In any case, he could quite see himself as high priest, even if it was for the evil Apophis. Jubilo explained to Simeon and Levi who the two secret holding priests were, and the optimum time and place to corner them. Perhaps Jubilo even lured them into a trap. Both were caught, but refused to provide any details at all, so they were killed to protect the conspirators. Now only one desperate option remained, an attack on the king himself. Jubilo was terrified by this time, but was well past the point of no return, so he led his co-conspirators to the temple of Amun-Re as the sun was just about to reach its highest point. A short time later, the king emerged from the doorway where he was told to give up the secrets. He refused, and the first blow was struck. Within a matter of minutes, King Sequenenre lay dead on the temple floor in a pool of blood. In blind fury and frustration, one of the brothers struck the prone corpse twice further. Jubilo was physically sick with fear. All three knew that they were suddenly alone without a friend in the world. They would be hunted down by the Thebans. Joseph would give them no sympathy, and Apophis would be wild with rage at the permanent loss of the great secrets. Their failure was truly spectacular. The secrets were lost forever, and a fully fledged war to avenge Sequenenre would soon be conducted by Chamos and Amos, the sons of the murdered king. A war that would drive the Hyksos out of Egypt forever. The walls certainly tumbled about their heads. Whew, man, it's a long chapter. Okay, I've got a good place to pause coming up. So I'll read to there, and then I'm going to pause and go get some water. What then of the treacherous priest? He was caught several days later hiding out in the desert behind Thebes in the place that we now call the Valley of the Kings. He was brought back to the temple and made to explain his part in the treachery, as well as giving details of the whole plan hatched by Apophis and his Asiatic vizier Joseph. On hearing the full details, Sequenenre's son Chamos was outraged at the wicked act of the Hyksos, but he was also deeply troubled by the fact that he could not be made king himself. The lost secrets would deny him the opportunity to become the Horus. For him and his supporters, this was a disaster beyond compare. Chamos gathered a council of the surviving senior priests, and one of them, destined to become a new high priest, came up with a remarkable analysis of the situation and a blindingly brilliant solution to the dilemma. He observed that Egypt had come into existence thousands of years ago in the age of the gods, and that the rise of the two lands had been created through the murder of Osiris by his brother Set. The goddess Isis had not given in and had resurrected the dismembered body of Osiris to cause him to father a boy child, the son of God called Horus. Horus was himself a god who grew to manhood and fought the evil Set in a mighty battle in which the Horus lost an eye and Set lost his testicles. The young god was deemed to have won the battle, but it was nonetheless an indecisive victory with an ongoing tension between good and evil. The wise priest went on to explain that Egypt had grown strong after this battle, but the two lands had slowly aged and gone into decline. The power of the god Set had increased with the arrival of the Hyksos, who worshipped him, and the serpent Apophis. There had just been another battle on Earth like the battle between the first Horus and Set, but this time Set had won with the current Horus, and the current Horus had lost. In this recent battle, the king, the Horus, again had an eye struck out before he died. The answer was to remember the wisdom of Isis and refuse to give up just because a god had been slain. He slowly lifted his hand and pointed a finger at the quaking young priest and shouted, "There is the manifestation of Set. He will help us defeat the evil one." Sequenenre's body was in poor condition through spending many days in its rough internment. But the embalmers managed to prepare him in the usual way. As part of his punishment, Jubilo was continually dipped in sour milk, and in the desert heat the decaying protein soon caused him to stink, giving him the distinctive hallmark of the evil one. When the time came for Sequenenre's Osiris ceremony and Chamos's simultaneous Horus ceremony, everything was prepared, but there were two coffins, not one. The first anthropoid coffin was splendid and literally fit for a sweet-smelling god king. The second was plain white without any inscription. As the moment of the ceremonies drew near, the stinking, semi-delirious Jubilo was brought in naked to the embalmers. His hands were held at his sides, and with one deft slash of a knife his genitals were struck off and thrown to the floor by Chamos himself, who was about to become the Horus. The whimpering Jubilo was then wrapped in mummification bandages working upwards from the feet. He was allowed to leave his hands touching the wound that was causing him so much agony, as this would demonstrate to every onlooker the point of this evil creature's injury. The bandages finally reached Jubilo's head, and the embalmers drew them tightly around his face until he was wholly covered. As soon as the grip was released on him, he was placed in the coffin. Jubilo pushed his head backwards to straighten his trachea and forced his mouth wide open in an attempt to breathe through the suffocating bandages. He died within minutes after his coffin lid was sealed down. Jubilo paid dearly for his betrayal. The wise new high priest had told Chamos that substituted secrets would have to be created to replace the genuine ones that had been lost with the killing of his father. A new ceremony resurrecting the new king from a fugitive death was designed to replace the old method, and new magic words were created to raise him to the status of Horus. The new ceremony told the story of the death of the last king of the first Egypt and the new king became a reborn nation. And with the new king came a reborn nation. Sorry. The body of Jubilo traveled to the kingdom of the dead with Sequenenre so that the battle could continue, Set in the form of Jubilo without his testicles, and the new Osiris, like the first Horus, without his eye. The priests had cleverly arranged things so that the battle would continue where it was left off at the beginning of time. The war was far from over. Chamos stuck a very clear finger in the air to Apophis when he chose the throne name Wajkeper, which means flourishing is the manifestation of Re. In other words, you failed, I'm doing fine with the royal secrets. As Chamos was raised from a figurative death, so was his nation. The period we now call the New Kingdom soon started, and Egypt became a proud country once again. Okay, so that's where I saw the good place to pause. So I'm going to pause there, go get some water, and I'll be right back. It'll only take a minute. Okay, let's go ahead and jump back into it. We've got about 10-ish pages left. Okay, so the physical evidence, that's the name of this subtitle, I don't know, section title. The story we have just related is admittedly fictionalized in part to put over the thrust of what we confidently believe happened all those thousands of years ago. Nonetheless, the only parts that we have added to tell this story are the tiny points of detail that glue together the core facts that we have uncovered. We used biblical evidence to establish an involvement of Joseph and his brothers, but the young priest that we called Jubilo came to our attention through long poring over ancient Egyptian records. We could hardly believe our good fortune when we came across the remains of a young man who has puzzled Egyptologists for well over 100 years. Of all the mummies found in Egypt, two stood out to us as being unusual. Sequenenre's is unique in being the only king to have met a violent end, and another corpse stood out for other radical reasons. Searching for information on all recorded mummies, we were immediately struck by the details of the very strange remains of a young man who in life had been just over 5 feet 8 inches tall. Photographs of the unwrapped mummy were striking because of the appearance of extreme agony on the face, as well as the details of the burial, which were unprecedented. The body had not been embalmed, and in that there was no incision, and all internal organs were in place. whilst the individual had therefore not been mummified in the usual sense of the word, he had been wrapped in a normal manner. Strangely, no attempt had been made to set the angle of the head or compose the facial features, and the initial effect is of a man emitting a long, terrible scream. The arms are not at the side of the body, nor crossed on the chest in the usual manner, but stretched downwards with the cupped hands covering, yet not quite touching, the pubic region. Beneath the hands is a space where the genitals should be. This man had been castrated. His plaited hair is inexplicably covered in a cheese-like material, which struck us as the result one would expect of successive dippings in sour milk with the aim of making him smell evil. The demons of darkness had a highly developed sense of smell and would recognize their own kind. The teeth are in good condition, and the ears had been pierced, both of which suggested high birth. The mummy was found in a white-painted cedar coffin which bore no inscription at all, making identification impossible, but experts consider that he must have been a noble or a member of the priesthood. Dating has proved difficult, but it is widely felt to be from the 18th dynasty, which began shortly after the death of Seqenenre Tao. One important clue that has previously been missed lies in the ridges that have formed in the skin of the face. These are highly unusual, but are also present on one other mummy, that of Amos-in-Hapi, the widow of Seqenenre. These ridges were thought to be due to over-tight bandaging, and this common feature suggests that the same heavy-handed person did the bandaging. Our diagrams illustrate how the angle of these ridges strongly suggests that the young priest was alive when he was wrapped and entombed. This unidentified corpse has not created much interest in Egyptologists, who naturally tend to focus on mummies of the famous, but it has long been suggested that this unembalmed body shows all the signs of having been alive at the time of burial. The official estimated dating of early New Kingdom was unbelievably close to our target area, and we started to wonder if the young man's mummy had been discovered in the Thebes area, thereby having a possible connection to our murdered king. We quickly established that it was found by Emil Bruges in 1881, not only in Thebes, but in the royal cache at Deir el-Bahri, right alongside Seqenenre Tao. This was not the original tomb of either of them, but the likelihood is that they were both moved from the same site at the same time at a later date. As the possibility of coincidence evaporated, we knew that with utter certainty that we had not only found Hiram Abif, we had also discovered the circumstances of the killing and identified one of the murderers 3,500 years after the event. We felt like all detectives feel when they solve a difficult case. We drank rather a lot of champagne that night. The unfortunate Jubilo, however, never did manage to escape the presence of his victim. The young priest is now in the Cairo Museum, catalog number 61023, along with Seqenenre Tao, catalog number 61051. The Masonic evidence. Okay, I'm going to sit back again here. The Masonic evidence. Once we sobered up from the celebrations of our solving of the Seqenenre murder, we sat down together and considered our next step. Again, we returned to Masonic ritual to search out another clue in our reconstruction of the development of the secrets of the kings. The whole story of Seqenenre and his killers is the story of Egypt undergoing reincarnation, and it is the story of Hiram Abif. The two are one and the same. The Bible fills in some blank areas, and human remains provide irrefutable forensic evidence, despite a gap of 3,500 years. But we found that the Masonic evidence goes still deeper. Chris turned his attention to the secret words used in the third degree ceremony, which is the Master Mason raising ceremony. The words are spoken in a whisper to the newly resurrected brother and are never spoken out loud. They seem complete gibberish. Both words are very similar in structure and sound as though they are composed of a string of very short syllables in the style of the ancient Egyptians. Chris broke them down into syllables, and in very short time he sat back and looked wide-eyed at something that made perfect sense. The sounds uttered in open lodge are Ma'at Neb Mem A Ma'at Ba'a. Those readers who are Freemasons will recognize these words, but will be astounded to know that they are pure ancient Egyptian. Their meaning is breathtaking. Quote, "Great is the established master of Freemasonry, great is the spirit of Freemasonry." End quote. We have translated Ma'at as Freemasonry because there is no other modern single word that comes close to the original complex concept that conveyed a whole bundle of ideas around truth, justice, fairness, harmony, and moral rectitude as symbolized by the regular purity of the perfectly upright and square foundations of a temple. Ma'at was, as we saw earlier, an attitude to life that blended the three most important values that mankind possesses, namely the knowledge of science, the beauty of art, and the spirituality of theology. That is the craft of Masonry. The other translations are straightforward on a word-for-word basis. We have reconstructed these words in hieroglyphics to demonstrate their Egyptian origin, although we doubt that they have ever been written down in any language prior to this book. Okay, and he has a picture, or they have a picture here, right in the middle of the text. Focus, there we go. The questions that we had to ask ourselves was how come these few words have survived intact over such a vast period of time. We believe that these utterances have survived the possibility of translation into later languages, Canaanite, Aramaic, French, and English, because they have been viewed as the magic words, the incantation which made the resurrection of the new candidate something more than symbolic. Their original meaning was probably long lost by the time of Solomon. Looking back to the very beginning of the New Kingdom, we could sense the power of these words when we imagine Chamos being raised as the first candidate following the murder of his father, the figure we know as Hiram Key. The import is rather like, "The king is dead, long live the king." The newly resurrected candidate is the spirit of Ma'at, Freemasonry, living on past the deaths of those that have gone before. This fossilized incantation gave us more powerful evidence to support our thesis. If anyone now wants to suggest, where did I get suggest? I don't, it's nothing even close. Start that sentence over. If anyone now wants to question that Sequenenre was Hiram Abiff, they have to explain away the fact that the modern Masonic ceremony contains two lines of pure ancient Egyptian at the very core of the ritual. It has long been established by cultural anthropologists that information is effectively passed on to successive generations by tribal ritual without the exponents necessarily having any idea of what they are transmitting. In fact, it is widely agreed that the very best way of transmitting ideas without distortion is via people that do not understand what they are saying. A good example of this can be seen the way in which children's rhymes still survive more perfectly than old stories that have been subsequently written down and embellished by a series of well-intentioned improvers. For example, many English children still chant "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo," a rhyme based on a counting system that certainly predates the Roman occupation of Britain and possibly even the Celts. It has survived intact for 2,000 or 3,000 years, and left to its own devices, it might well last as long again. The fossilized Egyptian incantation concerning Ma'at has come down to Freemasons via 2 long verbal traditions and a period of hibernation beneath Herod's temple. Reverence for its magical qualities has sustained it long after the meaning of the words had drifted away. This discovery gave us some really powerful evidence to support our developing thesis, and anyone wanting to question our claim that Seqenenre was Hiram Abiff has now to explain how it is that the modern Masonic ceremony contains 2 lines of pure ancient Egyptian at the very core of the ritual. We believe that for these sounds to translate into sensible English by coincidence would be to defy odds measured in millions to one, but given that the resulting English words convey precise and entirely relevant meaning, chance must be ruled out altogether. Struggling with this one tonight. Okay. We found that other connections with Freemasonry abound when the structure of the New Kingdom Egyptian priesthood and senior officials are looked at. Descriptions of roles sound immediately Masonic. The first prophet of Queen Hatshepsut was also known as the overseer of works, and the first prophet of Ptah was the master craftsman, or the master artificer. We knew that Masonry could not have copied these descriptions because, as we have already pointed out, there was no means to translate Egyptian until long after the craft was founded, like 100 years or something like that. The more we looked, the more connection emerged. In ancient Egypt, a man would serve at the temple associated with the god of his trade. The moon god Thoth was connected to architects and scribes, and it was Thoth that later became an object of interest to early Freemasons. We also found connection with the Essenes, the founders of the Jerusalem church, in that Egyptian priests would wear only white cloth robes and spent large periods of time cleansing and purifying themselves. They abstained from sexual relations and were circumcised and had taboos on certain foods, including shellfish. They used water in an almost baptismal way and used incense to cleanse their clothes. The observances of the Essenes were indeed ancient. We thought we had extracted as much as we could possibly hope for from this section of our investigation, but then a thought occurred to Robert. Masonic ritual refers to Hiram Abiff as the son of the widow, but which has never had any explanation, but suddenly 2 connected interpretations emerged. In Egyptian legend, the first Horus was uniquely conceived after his father's death, and therefore his mother was a widow, even before his conception. It seemed logical, therefore, that all those who thereafter became Horus, i.e., the kings of Egypt, would also describe themselves as son of the widow, a particularly apt title for Orchamos, the son of the widow Amos in Hapi, wife of Seqenenre Dao II. Ugh. Okay, we've got like 4 pages left. We'll get through this. I'm really glad I decided not to do 2 chapters tonight, though, I'll tell you that. Okay, let's go. Second Tao the Fearless. We can now be certain that the story of Hiram Abiff was historical and not symbolic, as most Masons, including ourselves, at first believed. Previously, it had seemed to us that a ritualized history had been invented to illuminate important symbolic points, but it was the other way around. The symbolism had been extracted from reality. The event marks a massively important turning point in Egyptian theology, when the secrets of the star cult and magic of king-making were lost for all time. The ancient Egyptians recognized something very special about King Seqenenre, who died at the age of about 30 because he was given the designation the Fearless in accounts that refer to him. Because of the brutal nature of his injuries, some observers have speculated that he died in battle with the Hyksos, although most agree that it is equally likely that he was assassinated. The battle theory ignores records that show there was peace with the Hyksos until the reign of Chamos, and had Seqenenre died a hero in battle, Egyptian accounts would not be silent about the means of his death. Seqenenre was obviously regarded as dying a hero for some other, more unusual reason than leading his troops into battle. We were now certain that this title was bestowed by a grateful people for keeping the greatest secrets of the two lands, even in the face of death. Certainly, Seqenenre the Fearless's death was the start of Egypt regaining its freedom from the invaders. As Thebes prepared for war against the Hyksos in revenge for this wicked murder, Seqenenre's son, King Chamos, eventually inflicted crushing reverses on the wretched Asiatic, and the Hyksos were soon routed out of Memphis. The women of the last Hyksos king, Apophis' successor Apepi II, had the terrifying experience of watching the Theban fleet, led by a general by the name of Amas, sail up the Patetku Canal to the very walls of the Hyksos capital, Avaris. The Hyksos were finally driven completely out of Egypt by Chamos' younger brother and successor, Amos, who chased them back to Jerusalem. Unable to escape by sea, no less than 240,000 households are said to have made their way across the Sinai and Negev deserts. Strangely, the route they took was known as Wat Hor, the Way of Horus. In conclusion, the major drama that unfolded in Thebes at the end of the first half of the second millennium BC was a crucial point in Egyptian history. It was an obvious rerun of the battle between good and evil that created the country 2,000 years earlier. The old kingdom of Egypt had been born, grown, matured, aged, and finally died at the hands of the wicked god Set, who had this time brought his followers down upon the people like a plague. Egypt, like Osiris itself, had been dead for a time. After this period of death, Amun-Re had fought a battle with the ancient serpent god, the force of darkness, Apophis, who had taken the form of a Hyksos king. Perhaps sensing that Egypt was about to be resurrected, Apophis had tried vainly to secure the secret of Osiris for himself. He failed because of the fearlessness of Seqenenre Tao, who died himself rather than betray those great secrets. He was the king that was lost, because his body was found too late to allow him to be resurrected personally, and because the secret of Osiris died with him. From that time onwards, the original secrets of how Isis raised Osiris have been replaced by substituted secrets, and no king of Egypt ever again joined the stars. It looks like him in a laundry basket. Yeah, okay. I have a screen behind me, yeah. From this time onwards, the rulers of Egypt were not kings. They became mere pharaohs, which comes from the Egyptian per'ah, and a euphemism for king meaning great house, rather as the United States of America sometimes refers to its power base as the White House instead of the president himself. The absolute divine right of the individual was gone forever. Not only was one king lost, all kings were lost for all time. Despite the loss of the secrets, the resurrection of Egypt was highly successful, and the new kingdom became the last great period for the Egyptians. The death and resurrection had led to a rebirth that brought new strength and vigor to the whole nation. Oh, by the way, welcome in. I jumped back into reading without greeting you. Thank you. The remaining questions that we needed to answer to confirm fully the link between Hiram Abif and Sekenenre Tao were: why is Sekenenre remembered as a builder, and how did he become associated with King Solomon's temple? The first part was straightforward. Sekenenre was the greatest protector of Ma'at, the principle of truth and justice that is represented as building the straight and square foundations of a temple. As regards the second part, we would soon go on to establish that the Israelites had direct access to this dramatic story, and it was used in the royal house of David to provide them with a structure of kingly secrets that their new and cultureless monarchy did not have. When the time came to write down the history of this legend, the Jews changed its Egyptian origin and attributed it to the greatest moment in the history of their own nation, the building of King Solomon's temple. The hero of the Jewish story could not be the king because the story of Solomon was well known, so they created a role that was the next best thing, the builder of the great temple. The secrets of building and the wisdom of the builder were understood by everyone, so there could not have been a better resurrection for Sekenenre the Fearless. An Egyptian origin for Hiram Abif solved another problem. Once we realized that our central character, Hiram Abif, was worshipping not Yahweh, but the sun god Re, literally the Most High, we could understand the significance of noon as the ultimate time of worship. Freemasons today claim always to meet symbolically at noon on the basis that Freemasonry is a worldwide organization, and therefore the sun is always at its meridian with respect to Freemasonry. Masonic reference to God as the Most High is therefore a description of Re, the sun god, in his ultimate position, the zenith of the heavens at noon. In addition, it is worth noting that the Bible tells us that before the Israelites adopted the name Yahweh, the God of our fathers, was referred to as El Elyon, a Canaanite rendering of God the Most High. This strengthens the link between the original Egyptian story and the Israelites who took it with them. We came across one further piece of circumstantial but highly significant evidence. This concerns King Thutmosis III, who, you will recall from the previous chapter, was made king as a result of the god choosing him in the temple by making his ark too heavy for its bearers. Thutmosis III was the fourth king after the departure of the Hyksos, and everything about his life tells us that the secrets of the stars-based religion and the making of Osiris and Horus had already been lost. The fact that he had to the fact that he had to substantiate his claim to be thrown by, wow, let me try that a third time. The fact that he had to substantiate his claim to the throne by means of the ark story demonstrates that he did not feel that he had a clear and absolute divine right to rule, in contrast to earlier kings, but it is the fact that he was usurped by another is particularly revealing of his lack of divinity. I'm going to stumble my way through it. We're almost there. 2 pages. Thutmose II had died without producing a legitimate male heir, with his wife and half-sister Hatshepsut, and a boy born of a relationship with a concubine had taken the throne. But he cannot have been made the Horus by the secret king-making technique. At first the young Thutmose III had no difficulty in establishing his kingship, but things were about to develop in an unprecedented way. Ancient hieroglyphics show how Hatshepsut first came from the background to claim equal status with Thutmose, then rapidly overwhelmed him to become the first woman to have the rightful divine progeny of the god Amun-Re. Thutmose III was then dispatched for military training to ensure that there was no confusion as to who was in control. Like most women who reached the top, she was an immensely powerful person who achieved many great things. Her impressive mortuary temple on the west bank of the Nile remains today as one of the most staggering and beautiful buildings of all time. Without doubt, the noble death of Sekenenre Tao marked the resurrection of the world's greatest civilization and the point at which the true secrets of the royal line of Egypt were lost forever. The substituted secrets were created to provide the necessary rite of passage for future pharaohs and their closest advisors, but the absolute right to rule imbued by the original secrets did not pass forward with the new mysteries. Our success in our quest had continued remarkably smoothly, and Robert posed the question, the answers are coming so thick and fast, could it be that we are starting to see what we want to see? We decided that we should review exactly where we were and the evidence that we had amassed, and having looked dispassionately at each link in the chain of our theory, we were more certain than ever that we were into a new vein of factual history, and what we had uncovered was producing such elegant continuity because it was true. Our next challenge was to understand how the legend of an Egyptian king killed by proto-Israelites was transformed into an event in the history of the new nation of the Jews. We now knew that we would have to unravel the circumstances of the greatest legend in the history of the Jewish people, the prophet Moses. Okay, so just barely over 1 page to go here. Conclusion. They'd have a conclusion at the end of every chapter. Focusing on the Hyksos period of ancient Egypt had produced results beyond all expectation. We now knew who Hiram Abif was, and to add to our joy, we had located his body and that of one of his murderers. We had looked at the role of Egypt in the history of the Jews, and it became obvious that from the Bible that there had been a complete change in attitude toward the Hebrews by the Egyptians. But what was more interesting was that the Bible did not say what the Bible did not say. There is no reference to the period of the Hyksos invasion of Egypt, yet closer investigation allowed us to date the Hyksos period quite accurately from Old Testament information. Further, careful study of the book of Genesis had allowed us to deduce that Abraham was contemporary with the Hyksos invasion, and indeed we suspect he may even have been a Hyksos, which means desert prince. The last influential proto-Jew in Egypt was Joseph, and by careful matching of biblical and historical evidence, we found that Joseph was vizier to Apophis, the invader king who was involved in a major battle for supremacy with the Theban king Sekenenre Tao II. Sekenenre was heir to the ancient Egyptian secret rituals of king-making and was by right the true Horus. Apophis had taken an Egyptian throne name, but was never privy to the secrets of king-making. We have found a reference in Genesis 49:6 to the killing of a man by the brothers of Joseph whilst trying to force a secret from him, and we had discovered that the mummy of Sekenenre shows most clearly that he had been killed by 3 blows to the head and then not immediately preserved. This fitted exactly all the facts we knew about the story of Hiram Abif. As we investigated further, we found that near Sekenenre, a young priest had been buried alive. Using evidence of the pattern of mummy bandages, we were able to prove this corpse was dated to exactly the same period as Sekenenre. Using all this evidence and the Masonic story we knew so well, we were able to reconstruct the story of the killing of Sekenenre and how it resulted in the fall of the Hyksos. Uh-oh. Okay, I was cutting out again there. Knowing this about the killing of Hiram Abif, we now could finally understand the meaning of two whispered words used in the Masonic raising ceremony, which phonetically translated into ancient Egyptian and still made sense in English. Great is the established master of Freemasonry. Great is the spirit of Freemasonry. Here at last was a firm link with modern Freemasonry. Two meaningless and pointless words which had only survived because Masonic ritual is learned by rote and repetition. With our link to Sekenenre and the real story of Hiram Abif firmly established, we now faced a gap of nearly 1,500 years to the only group who could have buried that information for the Templars to find. We had to trace the development of Judaism up to the flowering of the Essenes and our